The streets of Caracas hum with restless energy. Vendors shout over the din of traffic. Buses rattle past walls painted with fading slogans of the Bolivarian Revolution, and in the distance, the presidential palace looms like a fortress of memory. Nicolás Maduro sits at its center, inheritor of a promise that once electrified the nation. He is calm, deliberate, his voice measured, but behind his words lies the weight of a country unraveling. The revolution had begun with Hugo Chavez, a soldier turned populist who spoke of dignity, sovereignty, and justice. His charisma was thunderous, his presence magnetic. He promised to lift the poor, to challenge imperialism, to make Venezuela a beacon of independence. For a time, the dream seemed real. Oil revenues poured into social programs, clinics, schools, and food subsidies. Millions felt included, empowered, part of a new story. But dependency on oil was a trap, and when prices fell, the foundation cracked. Maduro rose from the ranks of loyalty, a bus driver turned union leader, chosen by Chavez as successor. His first election in 2013 was narrow, contested, and already shadowed by accusations of fraud. Crowds filled the streets, some chanting Maduro sí, others shouting fraude. The divisions were stark, the atmosphere tense. Power in Venezuela was never simply about ballots, it was about the military's loyalty. The intelligence networks, the patronage systems that bound generals, ministers, and businessmen to the survival of the regime. Maduro understood this instinctively. To govern was to secure, to silence, to manage dissent. Opposition leaders rose and fell like waves against a fortified shore. Leopoldo López, fiery and defiant, was imprisoned. Henrique Capriles, pragmatic and persistent, was sidelined. Later, Juan Guaidó would declare himself interim president, recognized by dozens of countries, his rallies swelling with hope. For a moment, the world believed change was imminent, but the machinery of power in Caracas proved more resilient than the chants of the crowds. The military did not defect. The intelligence services did not fracture. The regime endured, not through popularity but through control. The economy unraveled. Venezuela's oil reserves, the largest in the world, became a curse when global prices fell. Revenues evaporated, and the state's ability to fund social programs collapsed. Hyperinflation followed, erasing the meaning of money. Salaries vanished in a single day, and citizens carried bags of bolivars to buy bread. Supermarket shelves emptied, queues stretched for hours, and scarcity became a daily ritual. Hunger was not just physical, it was psychological, a gnawing reminder of promises broken. Families improvised meals, children fainted in schools, and survival itself became resistance. The revolution that had promised abundance delivered hunger, and the slogans painted on walls faded into irony. The humanitarian crisis spilled across borders. Millions fled, crossing into Colombia, Brazil, Peru, and beyond, creating the largest migration in Latin America's modern history. Hospitals ran out of supplies, doctors emigrated, and illnesses once treatable became deadly. Mothers carried infants across bridges. Fathers searched for work in foreign cities, and the Venezuelan diaspora became a nation scattered. Inside Venezuela, those who remained adapted to scarcity with resilience. Music played, baseball games continued, families gathered, and life found rhythm even in collapse. The psychological landscape was one of contradiction, despair and endurance, silence and song. Internationally, Venezuela became a battlefield of geopolitics. The United States tightened sanctions, aiming to choke the regime's finances, while Russia, China, and Iran offered lifelines. Maduro's survival was not merely domestic, it was global, a product of alliances and rivalries that turned Caracas into a symbol of defiance against Western pressure. Sanctions became both weapon and excuse. Washington framed them as punishment for authoritarianism, while Maduro used them to explain shortages and rally nationalist sentiment. The Guaido moment dissolved into stalemate. As the regime endured through loyalty, fear and external support, inside Venezuela, propaganda filled the airwaves. State television broadcast triumphs, ignoring shortages. Reality was edited, truth negotiable. Citizens whispered in kitchens, avoided politics in public, and learned that silence was survival. Yet resilience persisted. Even in collapse, life found rhythm. A grandmother taught her grandson to dance joropo in a dimly lit living room. A street musician played cuatro on a corner, his notes rising above the noise of scarcity. A teacher, unpaid for months, still gathered children to read poetry. These fragments of life were acts of defiance, reminders that even in silence humanity endures. Justice loomed in distant tribunals. The International Criminal Court began investigations, and human rights organizations documented abuses. Memory became a weapon, even when justice was delayed. One day, Venezuela's pain would be archived in museums, ration cards, propaganda posters, oil contracts, uniforms labeled "worn to start a war." The silence around these artifacts would speak louder than any broadcast. The revolution that began with a promise of dignity had become a case study in collapse, a cautionary tale of dependency, authoritarianism, and resilience. And so the script flows not in acts but in echoes. Venezuela remains a nation of contradictions, rich in oil, poor in bread, loud in slogans, quiet in kitchens. Maduro sits at the center of this paradox, calm but haunted, presiding over a revolution that became survival, a state that became silence. The story does not end neatly. It lingers, heavy with history, waiting for its verdict. The nights in Caracas are heavy with silence. Streetlights flicker over empty boulevards, and the hum of generators fills the gaps where electricity fails. In apartments, families gather around radios, listening not for truth but for survival. The broadcasts speak of triumphs, of victories against imperialism, of a nation standing tall. Yet outside, the reality is queues for bread, pharmacies without medicine, and children fainting in classrooms. The dissonance between words and life is stark, and the silence in kitchens becomes louder than the slogans on television. Citizens learn to whisper, to avoid politics in public, to survive through discretion. Fear is not always visible, but it lingers in the pauses between conversations. Maduro's government thrives on this silence. Propaganda is relentless, painting shortages as sabotage, dissent as treason, and sanctions as proof of foreign aggression. The narrative is carefully constructed. Venezuela is under siege, and unity is the only path to survival. Yet beneath the slogans lies exhaustion. Teachers continue to teach without pay. Doctors improvise treatments without supplies, and musicians play in plazas where hunger gnaws at the audience. These acts of endurance are quiet rebellions, reminders that life persists even in collapse. The international stage becomes a theater of contradictions. Washington tightens sanctions, freezing assets, restricting oil sales, and isolating the regime. European nations debate recognition of opposition figures, while Russia and China extend loans, investments, and diplomatic shields. Iran sends fuel shipments, defying embargoes, and Turkey becomes a trading partner. Maduro's survival is not merely domestic, it is geopolitical, sustained by alliances that turn Caracas into a symbol of defiance against Western pressure. Each speech at the United Nations becomes a performance. Each handshake with foreign leaders a declaration that Venezuela is not alone. Yet the cost of survival is borne by ordinary citizens whose lives shrink under scarcity. The Guaido moment in 2019 was a crescendo of hope, Crowds filled plazas, waving flags, chanting for change. International recognition poured in, and for a moment, the regime seemed vulnerable. But the military did not defect. The intelligence services did not fracture. And the machinery of control remained intact. Hope dissolved into stalemate, and the opposition fractured under the weight of disappointment. The regime endured, not through popularity but through resilience, fear and external support. Hyperinflation becomes a character in the script, a force that erases meaning from numbers. Salaries vanish in hours, prices double overnight, and citizens carry stacks of bills to buy a loaf of bread. The bolivar becomes a symbol of collapse, its notes discarded, its value mocked. Dollars circulate in markets, barter replaces currency, and survival becomes improvisation. A mother trades rice for medicine. A father sells tools for fuel. A child learns that money is paper without power. The economy is not just broken, it is surreal. A landscape where value dissolves and scarcity defines existence. The collapse of the health system deepens the crisis. Hospitals lack supplies, doctors emigrate, and illnesses once treatable become deadly. Patients lie in corridors, families bring their own medicine, and surgeries are postponed indefinitely. The human cost is immense, and the silence around it is haunting. Illness becomes political, survival becomes resistance, and the promise of dignity fades into desperation. Migration reshapes the nation. Millions cross borders carrying bags, children, and memories. Bridges into Colombia become rivers of humanity. Bus stations in Peru fill with Venezuelan accents, and neighborhoods in Brazil absorb new arrivals. The diaspora becomes a scattered nation, connected by WhatsApp calls, remittances, and nostalgia. Families are divided, grandparents left behind, children raised abroad. The exodus is not just physical, it is emotional, a rupture that redefines identity. Venezuela becomes both homeland and memory, a place of longing and loss. Inside the country, resilience persists. Music plays in plazas, baseball games continue, families gather for meals improvised from scarcity. Life finds rhythm even in collapse. A grandmother teaches her grandson to dance joropo. A teacher reads poetry to children. A street musician plays cuatro on a corner. These fragments of life are acts of defiance, reminders that humanity endures even in silence. Justice looms in distant tribunals. The International Criminal Court investigates. Human rights organizations document abuses, and testimonies accumulate. Memory becomes a weapon, even when justice is delayed. One day, Venezuela's pain will be archived in museums. Ration cards, propaganda posters, oil contracts, uniforms labeled "worn to start a war." The silence around these artifacts will speak louder than any broadcast. The revolution that began with a promise of dignity becomes a case study in collapse, a cautionary tale of dependency, authoritarianism, and resilience. Maduro sits at the center of this paradox, calm but haunted, presiding over a revolution that became survival, a state that became silence. The story does not end neatly. It lingers, heavy with history, waiting for its verdict. The courtroom in Caracas is dim, its walls lined with portraits of leaders past, their eyes fixed on the proceedings as if history itself were watching. Prosecutors shuffle papers, defense attorneys whisper, and translators murmur behind glass. The atmosphere is heavy, not with justice fulfilled, but with justice deferred. Documents pile high, coded telegrams, photographs of rallies, testimonies of hunger, and each sheet is a fragment of a larger truth. The judges listen, their expressions restrained, their pens moving slowly across yellowed pages. Outside, the city waits, its streets filled with vendors, its plazas echoing with chants. its silence punctuated by the hum of generators inside. The trial is not just of individuals, but of a system, a revolution that promised dignity and delivered scarcity. The air is thick with history, and every word spoken carries the weight of a nation's memory. Maduro's name hovers over the proceedings like a shadow. Calm, deliberate, his speeches echo through the chambers, framed as defiance against imperialism, as defense of sovereignty. Yet the faces in the gallery tell another story, faces lined with hunger, eyes dulled by exile, expressions hardened by loss. The translators continue their work, their voices steady, their words bridging languages, carrying testimonies across borders. The trial is both local and global, a stage where Venezuela's contradictions are laid bare. The silence in the room is not emptiness, it is anticipation. The pause before history delivers its verdict. The Museum of the Future stands quiet, its halls filled with artifacts of collapse. Visitors move slowly, their footsteps echoing against polished floors. Behind glass cases lie ration cards, propaganda posters, oil contracts, and uniforms labeled "Worn to Start a War." A vintage radio hums with static, its voice long gone, its silence louder than any broadcast. Children press their hands against the glass, reading captions that speak of hunger, migration, and resilience. Elders walk with measured steps, remembering the cues, the whispers, the nights without light. The museum is not just a collection of objects, it is a testimony, a memory preserved, a warning etched in silence. In one corner, a mannequin wears a faded uniform, its label stark, "Worn to Start a War." The visitors pause, their reflections merging with the glass, their faces layered over the past. The atmosphere is soft, reflective, timeless. The revolution that began with chants of dignity ends here, in a hall of memory, where silence speaks louder than slogans. Venezuela remains a nation of contradictions, rich in oil, poor in bread, loud in speeches, quiet in kitchens. Maduro's shadow lingers, calm but haunted, presiding over a story that does not end neatly. It lingers, heavy with history, waiting for its verdict. The museum doors close softly, and outside the city breathes, carrying forward echoes of transmission, fragments of resilience and the weight of silence.